I'm going to talk about safeguarding and DoLS. I'll try and make it as interesting as I can, as I know that's a maybe a slightly overwhelming topic. But just to say that we're in a space now where we can look back over the sort of last 5 years and see what the trends are. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and also about nationally what the kind of picture looks like in terms of this data. So at the briefing, we've not looked at DoLS since the 2018-19 figures. So we thought this was a good opportunity, like I say, sort of now that we're coming out of the pandemic or out of it, to kind of look back and see what the picture's been. Before we go into DoLS, you might all know the kind of fiasco that is happening, and that maybe by this point we thought we might not have what are still being called DoLS. We thought that liberty protection safeguards would be in place, but it keeps getting delayed. And the government said in April of this year that it will be beyond the life of this parliament. So it can be something for Labour to maybe deal with if they do get into power next year. In terms of kind of what this data might look like the next time we decide to talk about safeguarding and DoLS or LPS, it will really depend on what the government decides to do in this space. And like I said, this comes from NHS Digital. So I'll talk about the Safeguarding Adults Data report first, and then I'll move on to talk about the DoLS data. So this here is the timeline from 2016-17 on the left there up to the current 22-23 data. So the sort of take-home message is that the trend is staying relatively similar. We didn't see sort of any kind of drastic dip or increase during the pandemic, and that the increase rate is about 9% for the dark blue. That's the safeguarding concerns that were raised. The grey are the section 42, and then the small blue is other. For the concerns, that's about a 9% increase year on year. For the section 42, it's quite hard to see the sort of granularity of it. Actually, the trends now have sort of settled, so to speak, and it's between 5 to 7% increase year on year for the section 42. So in terms of the concerns, we thought what would be useful would be to sort of map this across England. So per 100,000 adults in England, the average is about 1,300. What is fascinating from my perspective is the variation within this. So Newcastle are the clear outliers, and you'll see that that's the common theme as we go through. The North East is the outlier really when it comes to safeguarding. I mean, you could equally argue that West Sussex are also quite a big outlier, down at 248. So really what this shows us, is that there's huge variation in reporting of this, of interpretation of this. There's clearly a lack of consistency across the country about when concerns are raised and what triggers that process. That really must be down to local interpretation of what that guidance been. So whether that's a reflection on the guidance and the training that is available around this, but it's definitely context and kind of culturally specific as to a reflection of the numbers of people that are going through the process. So that's just a really interesting thing to sort of be cognizant of as we go through some of the data and the impact that might be having on care. And from this data, we can't kind of do that, but I think that would be a really interesting piece of work. Is it better in Newcastle that they have such a high rate? I don't think it should be seen as a negative that the rate is high, but equally we don't know that. So the trend continues. Newcastle, ding, 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 win the prize again. In terms of the Section 42 inquiries, as you'd expect, Bedford have snuck in at the bottom with 67. With all of these outliers, so with, on the previous one, with West Sussex, and here with Bedford and Newcastle, there's not been a drastic change. They've always been the areas that are kind of either at the top of the list or at the bottom of the list. So it's culturally, over years, this is their way of working. There's been no sort of sudden uptick because of a particular incident or training, for instance. So we thought it would be useful to show the time series of the types of risk that are coming up in these Section 42 inquiries specifically. So at the bottom is 2016-17, and then it goes all the way up to the present data. So you'll see in this light blue column here, this is neglect and acts of omission, so that takes up the kind of chunk, and there's no huge shift there in terms of that type of risk. Where there is a difference that we've noticed is here. So this is self-neglect, this light blue here, and as you can see, that has steadily over the years increased, which again, as kind of a concept, is quite an interesting point of discussion. So some areas might be seeing it as self-neglect. Some areas might see that as kind of a service failure, that they haven't got in soon enough to see that person. So what do we actually mean by self-neglect? And because of the way the data has been given to us, we're not able to interrogate sort of where that has come from or what those individuals look like, for instance. But I think that would be really interesting, is to delve deeper into kind of what are people's understanding of self-neglect and what does that actually entail. And then on the other side of the series, you'll see the grey column. That's domestic abuse. We think there's been quite a steady increase there from 17 to 18. I don't think the data was collected in 2016, 17. That's why it doesn't exist at all. And similarly with self-neglect, that's not on there. But with domestic abuse, there's increasing awareness, knowledge, understanding of that type of abuse. So I think that can account for that change there. But again, that's a kind of cultural, locally specific construct that they'll be deciding whether that falls within domestic abuse or any of the other types of abuse there. There's no kind of judgment from us about whether one approach is better or worse, but I think that actually this data lends itself to saying, okay, well, maybe we could kind of look at people's pathways, given that in one particular area it's much higher. You know, are they safer? Do they have a better standard of care, for instance? So I think there's definitely, it points to kind of areas where we could interrogate that and quite neatly get some answers as to the impact of this kind of legislation on care. This is overwhelming. I understand that, but there's so many different types. But this is just about location of the different types of abuse that we just showed on the previous slide. So when you read the report, they say that 47% of all abuse takes place in a person's own home, which you think, gosh, that's terrifying. But there are 108,000, so this is the proportion, these graphs, but I've taken out the actual figure. So that 48% figure refers to 108,000 people. Now, if you think of the amount of people living in their own homes, that's a very small percentage of the total. Whereas actually, for the two care homes, so for residential and nursing care, we're talking about nearly 70,000 individuals. And that is about 19% of all care home residents in England. So it's a much higher percentage. So with this data, it's just really interesting how they make you think that all of this abuse is taking place in a person's own home. But actually, when we look at a percentage of the individuals in those environments, it's much, much higher in care homes. So if you read the report, well, I say it's a report, it's some very brief headline messages that they've pulled out. They skew it very much towards the majority of abuse is taking place in people's own homes. But I personally don't think that is necessarily the case. So shall I run you through all of the colours quickly? But essentially, they go again sequentially through. But this blue one here is neglect and acts of omission in care homes. So like Tom said, that is providers neglect and act of omission within a care home setting. That's why those concluded Section 42s took place. Super interesting. Started this thinking it wasn't, but actually. And this is just to reflect, and I don't think this is a particularly shocking story, but that the majority of people involved in Section 42 are over 85, and that's 1 in every 38 adults in England over 85, and this trend has continued year on year. There's been no drastic shift there. And then this was just to show in terms of the age and the region. So this is by count, this isn't proportion. So obviously the northeast are much higher because Newcastle. But really, actually, the proportions are pretty stable in terms of 85 plus, 75 to 84, 65, and down to the younger age groups. So regardless of count, the proportion is still always skewed towards the older old. And then I just thought it was useful to show the gender split, that it again is pretty similar across the board, skewed slightly more to women, but if you consider that there's more women in the older populations, then that's as expected. And then just in terms of the kind of ethnic makeup, again, as expected, it's more diverse in London than the other areas. And then in terms of the primary support reason for the person that is involved in the Section 42, does that make sense? So the main reason that they're getting support, physical support is generally the primary reason across most of the areas. But what we thought it was interesting to just highlight, and we're not sure why, as with all of this data, but in the east of England, particularly the green and the purple here, so the green is support with memory and cognition, and the purple is learning disability support. They seem quite a larger proportion than the other areas. Like I say, I'm not quite sure why that is, but again, maybe that's because of some local agenda that's happening, or how they are interpreting and sort of categorising reasons for support for those individuals. But that will be interesting to see if that continues year on year. And then just finally on safeguarding, before I move on to DoLS, is just to talk about the adult reviews that have taken place. So the reason I wanted to show this was because the North East is at the bottom of this one for the first time in the presentation. So if we're going to make assumptions about the data, one could argue that whilst they have the highest number of safeguarding concerns in section 42s, actually, because there are so many of them, they're actually having less need to look into kind of serious incidents that have taken place, because it's sort of a preventative approach to risk. That might not be the case, but that might be one assumption for that. So just in summary, there's obviously a lack of consistency, and you're probably going to hear that with DoLS as well. But in terms of the pandemic and kind of looking back, like we said at the beginning, there really doesn't seem to have been much impact kind of globally on the trends. Neglect and acts of omission is still the most common type of risk. The North East are much, much higher in terms of the safeguarding concerns. And the take-home message in the report, like I say, they talk about the over 80s in their own homes, but I've added and care homes, because I think that's important to highlight. So I'll just run you through DoLS quickly. So this here is the applications received for DoLS from 15-16 to now. So you can see in 1920, or from 18-19 to 20, seemed to be quite an uptick, and then actually a slight lag afterwards in sort of 2020, and I think we can all think about why. But actually what we've seen over the last 2 years is that it's steadily increasing. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the urgent and the standard authorisations for them and the kind of breakdown of that. But I just thought, again, to show a very similar picture, it's not Newcastle this time though, it's Stockton-on-Tees. The interpretation and the use of DoLS varies wildly across the country. So the average per 100,000 adults in England is 664. In Ealing, it's in the 200s. Up in Stockton, it's in the 2000s. So again, this will be the same as safeguarding in terms of their interpretation of the data. So I thought this would be interesting just to show in terms of then when the DoLS applications start, the proportion that are classed as either standard or urgent. And again, I think it just says the same narrative, but about local interpretation of what these things look like. So this shows it here by region, but just to pull some of them out. So the S is for standard, the U is for urgent. So in Lincolnshire, 99.6 of them are classed as urgent, whereas in City of London and Cornwall, 100% of them are standard. So there's just such wild variation between how they interpret that, and then you can see that the red is urgent and the green is standard. So in the East Midlands and the North East and the South West, much more urgent than standard. And this is about the age group and the gender of the applications that are submitted. And we thought it was interesting just to show that there's a flip from 75 of male, female. So 18 to 64, there's quite a lot more men involved in DoLS applications than women. And then as those men start to die in the 70s, then the proportion of women seems to go through. And we don't have the breakdown of it. I mean, 18 to 64 is a wildly big age gap to look at. So it would be interesting if we could break that down further and see if maybe there's more what's deemed kind of risky behaviour by men in the kind of younger section, or are we talking about men in their 60s with kind of multiple health conditions who are in sort of unsafe environments? But unfortunately, we don't have that level of detail. And then just to show that, again, across the regions, age is kind of, when you look at the proportion across the regions, age actually sort of is pretty standard, and there's not kind of huge disparities there. Similarly, same picture with ethnicity as we saw with the safeguarding data. London is the outlier there, and the West Midlands creeping up a bit. And then I thought it was interesting to talk about, I'm going to talk about the completed applications, but also the not completed applications. So in terms of the completed applications, again, that went quite sort of stagnant during and slightly after COVID. Obviously, there was kind of other things going on, but actually it looks like that there's been a useful increase in the number that are completed. However, there's also been an increase in the number that are received. So as you'll see, actually, we're still not kind of catching up from where we were. It goes up about 10% every year, the number that and that looks really positive. You think, oh great, every year we're doing 10% more, but actually the amount received are going up by at least 11%. So we're not keeping up with the amount. So spoiler, there's a lot more that aren't completed. In terms of the completed per 100,000, I haven't put a map on, but it's Stockton is at the top in terms of completed. So they are receiving a lot of applications, but they're completing a lot of applications. So they seem to be doing quite well in Stockton. Maybe we need to do a case study on Newcastle, Stockton, and a few of the others. So this is a count of those not completed. So again, you'll see the disparity of those not completed, and that there's quite a big backlog in the southeast and the southwest. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. In total, across the country, there's about 125,000 that haven't been completed, and that's steadily creeping up. So it's 2% more than the previous year. That was a couple of percent more than the previous year. So we are slipping behind. Like I say, 10% are getting completed, but there's 11 to 12% being received every year. We're not closing the gap. So this shows they're not, everything's very dark, they're not completed. So some areas are doing really well. Lewisham's only got 10 that they've not completed, but sort of Surrey, Hampshire, they've got up to 5,000 that haven't been completed. I don't know the reasons why and kind of what's going on there. But yeah, it really highlights that a lot are being received, but actually what's happening once that's received would be quite an interesting thing to look at. So it was steadily creeping up about the numbers not completed, then it plateaued, and then it dropped because I think maybe people were able to catch up and there weren't so many received, so we were able to catch up on some of them, and then now we're slipping back behind basically in terms of completing them. About 19% get completed in 21 days, which has fallen by 1%, which never sounds like quite a lot. That's, 1%. We'll still take it. So it's fallen in terms of the numbers who've managed to complete within the 21 days, but the average length is 5 months for these to be completed. So it's 5.2 months in England. And again, the range is huge. Stockport, that's over 4 years. Now, I don't know what's going on there, and maybe they've just not clicked some button on something and it's not been reported properly, but 4 years. So again, what would be really interesting there is to look at the demographic. If that's an older person in a care home, that's not 4 years for them. So you might then start to be thinking, is an inappropriately received DoLS, and maybe I'm not sure what's happening there, but Stockport is a huge outlier, whereas South Gloucestershire, Wirral, there is definitely quite a large group that are around the sort of 2-year period that it's taking them to complete these. So to summarise the DoLS, there's a significant variance again between the councils. Stockton's got the highest rates, Ealing and Dudley at the lowest, and they're still taking a long time to complete. So just to wrap this up, like we've said, there's huge variety across the councils and the local authorities about their interpretation and their application of both the safeguarding and the DoLS legislation. The North East is the outlier in terms of these, but the patterns are relatively similar. Obviously, we've seen the kind of dips and upticks during the pandemic, but actually we're back to pre-pandemic trends, essentially. As per safeguarding and the DoLS, people over 80 are the client group that are kind of most involved in these.